morning, everyone. I'm Cassandra Johnson. I'm one of the PIs and really excited to be talking with you all today about our project. I'm going to dive right in, given the presentations that have preceded ours, and share a little bit about racial and ethnic disparities related to food insecurity. We know that food insecurity is a widespread issue, and it's already been documented here today, but we also know that food insecurity doesn't affect all households in the same way, that there are disparities along the lines of race and ethnicity. And because of the USDA Economic Research Service and their annual report, we know from 2020 that the prevalence of food insecurity was 17.2% for Latino households compared to 7.1% for white households. This means that Latino households had twice the burden of food insecurity compared to their white counterparts. In our project, we're focused on households headed by Latino, Latina, Latinx adult or adults, which we'll describe as Latinx from here on. This priority population has unique sociodemographic characteristics like the ones shown on the slide. Specifically, they are a large racial ethnic group in the United States with a fast population growth and disproportionately dealing with poverty and diet-related chronic diseases, exactly due to racism and other systemic and structural issues. As we attempt to create a more just and equitable future, we have to think about ways to improve access to safe, nutritious, affordable foods and make sure that Latinx households get the foods they need for all of the reasons: culture, health, well-being. So we know there are some important measurement issues with the FSSM, which have already been outlined again today. So I am just going to summarize here that because of the development of the FSSM, which was originally developed mostly from a small study done with white women and mothers from upstate New York, that it doesn't fully capture all experiences of food insecurity, especially for non-dominant cultural groups like Latinx households. At the same time, I have to acknowledge that the FSSM is a valid, reliable tool for its intended purpose with the federal government. And we are all here today to celebrate 25 years of accomplishments with the FSSM. So over the last 25 years, there have been several accomplishments, and I know those have been highlighted, but I just wanted to say it anyway, that the US has some of the best data on food insecurity around the world. With this fantastic tool, the government is able to monitor progress towards addressing food insecurity nationally and also evaluate federal nutrition and food assistance programs. At the same time, researchers have been able to use this tool as part of observational and experimental studies. And we have research. Many of the research has been conducted by people who are part of this webinar today and prior generations. We also know that it can underestimate prevalence, and it may not be fully capturing everyone's experiences, especially true for people who are from different cultures. And since there have been major shifts in US sociodemographics, it's really time to start thinking about how we can improve the measure specifically for Latinx households. So for Latinx households, social cultural norms influence people's experiences of food insecurity. And we know that some concepts covered in the FSSM may be confusing or not as relevant for respondents from Latinx households. For example, running out of food may not be an issue because people feel that there's always something to make or always something to eat. Personally, I've observed this in previous qualitative research that I've done. And given that the Latinx population is so varied with a lot of heterogeneity with people from different backgrounds, different who have different languages, we have to think about language. We have a Spanish language version of the FSSM, which is another remarkable accomplishment, but to date, no one has conducted cognitive testing with the Spanish FSSM. What this means is that we don't know as much about the relevance of the FSSM to other groups. So what is cognitive testing? I wanted to share just a little bit about that. I'm so nervous, my fingers are shaking. I'm gonna get, okay. For cognitive testing, I wanted to share. Okay, so the definition for cognitive testing is in-depth, open-ended probing to explore how the interviewee interprets and understands questionnaire items and response options. So what this looks like in an interview is using interview questions or probes like, tell me what you're thinking about when answering this question. Which parts of this question are confusing or unclear? And you would ask these questions for all of the items or questions that are contained in a survey instrument or questionnaire. So For my colleagues and I, what we really saw was an opportunity to advance food insecurity measurement by focusing on cognitive testing with a diverse sample of Latinx caregivers and parents to really advance measurement. And we have two primary aims, which are to understand how Latinx caregivers and parents understand, perceive and interpret the FSSM items and responses. And then a second aim related to how well the FSSM items capture their experiences related to different domains of food insecurity. And for this project, I'm really just going to focus on aim one, which is on cognitive testing. So a little bit about our project. Our project is Proyecto Mesa, the Mesa Project, Mejorando la Esperanza en Seguridad Alimentaria, or Improving Hope for Food Insecurity. And you can see our logo that we've now put on the bottom of our slides. So a little bit about this project. It is a cross-sectional qualitative approach, 100% remote, multi-site project happening in California, New York, and Texas, using in-depth interviewing with cognitive testing and exploratory interviewing with Latinx parents and caregivers to really advance food insecurity measurement with the FSM among the special priority. And from the very beginning throughout the research process, this project is also built on community engagement. So as I said, this is a 3-site project happening in California, New York, and Texas. Importantly, 2 of the 3 sites, California and New York, are recruiting parents and caregivers from large urban areas, and 1 site here in Texas is recruiting from a primarily rural region. So participants to be eligible for this study needed to self-identify as Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx, be a parent or caregiver, speak English, Spanish, or combination of both, living full-time in the recruitment areas, and then reporting some experiences of food insecurity as a parent or caregiver, and living in a household with a child under 18 at least part of the time. As a multi-site project, everyone submitted applications to the IRB with very similar processes, and everyone provided a $30 incentive in the form of a mailed or electronic gift card or cash transfer to all of the participants. So for the remote data collection, after determining eligibility and setting up the interview, we did recorded interviews, mostly over Zoom, although phone is a backup. Participants were asked to complete a brief socio-demographic survey and then to proceed with an in-depth interview that included both cognitive testing prompts and exploratory prompts. The full household version of the USDA FSSM was part of the interview guide, and at the end we would wrap up and arrange for the incentive. Because this interview was unique and included cognitive testing, I wanted to provide kind of an insight into what this looks like. So this is a real excerpt from our interview guide, and you can see lots of text and a very structured interview guide. To date, it's the most complicated one that I personally have used. And on this slide, you can see more clearly an excerpt that outlines some of the cognitive questions or cognitive testing probes, like tell me what you're thinking about when answering this question, which parts are unclear, what does this concept, here I'm featuring the I Am Balanced meal, what does this mean to you? And this is really specific for cognitive testing. So the cognitive testing that was done included cognitive testing for the screener item in the FSSM, which is household item 1, and then all 18 items of the FSSM, items for the household, adult referenced items, and also child items. So after the interviews were completed, we had kind of 2 different processes to generate those verbatim transcripts. One is we use Zoom for the English interviews and then work to use that as a basis for creating verbatim transcripts. The Spanish language interviews were professionally transcribed. We checked them for accuracy. Then we moved on to memoing, documenting those initial analytic insights, sharing those amongst the PIs, discussing them in peer debriefing with regular meetings. And then all of this has been used to create a code book to do more formal qualitative analysis and coding. And now I'm going to transfer it back to my colleague, Dr. McClain, to talk about the results.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. You can go ahead and advance to the next slide. So as qualitative work goes, we are still in the process of collecting data, but the beauty, of course, in qualitative work is we can start this analytical process iteratively during data collection. And of course, being in a pandemic, it has been challenging, and we'll talk a little bit more later about sort of our next steps in terms of continuing to recruit across the 3 sites. You can go to the next slide. So thus far, participants have been primarily women and young to middle aged. Participants have reported a variety of racial ethnic backgrounds, including white, Black, Indigenous, and other. Most participants up to now have been of Mexican heritage, with other participants identifying as Ecuadorian, Puerto Rican, or Salvadoran heritage. And slightly more than half of participants reported speaking Spanish as their primary language at home, and over 2/3 have reported Spanish or a combination of Spanish and English at home. You can go to the next slide. So we've combined, there we go. And then as you can see, the household size has ranged from 2 to 8, with the number of children in the household ranging from 1 to 5. Excuse me, you can go into the next slide. Most participants reported not working for pay, but had a partner in the household working up to 20 hours per week for pay. And then participants have frequently reported participating in federal nutrition and food assistance programs, particularly the free and reduced price school meals and the supplemental nutrition assistance program. You can go to the next slide. And overall, most of the sample have lived in households categorized as either low or very low food security, and as intentioned with sampling, no participants have lived in households with high food security. Next slide, please. So we've combined the results from comprehension and interpretation because these are overlapping in our participant responses. And while many of the FSSM household, adult, and child reference questions were interpreted as intended, many participants reported problems understanding FSSM questions and response options, including the length and complexity of the questions and the limited response options, meaning that the response options did not always fit their experience, or they lacked specificity that the participant was looking for in answering the question. Many participants also expressed emotional discomfort or embarrassment when responding to the questions or sharing about their food insecurity experiences. And in addition, Spanish translations, participants felt that they were often awkward or unclear. And later in the results, I'll present some specific unclear Spanish translations. Next slide, please. This quote was from a participant in New York who demonstrates how the question format is difficult. They said, question is long, a bit complicated. You have to think, repeat it, as I ask you to repeat it various times. Not a question easy to answer because I have to think too much. And the emotional toll that responding to these questions is captured in this example quote from a participant in California. Just hesitant. After the interviewer probed more about the hesitancy, she then said, because food insecurity is embarrassing, you know. And last, this example quote from a participant in Texas demonstrates how difficult they found the response options. Quote, it's pretty somewhat difficult because, like I said, multiple answers, meaning they could have chosen multiple response options because they all pertained to their situation. Next slide, please. So while the majority of participants said the questions were easy to answer, the participants often indicated that discussing food insecurity experiences were quite difficult emotionally. Next slide. A participant from New York said, this question reminds me of everything I lived, like it hits me again. That's why I locked myself in a room so that my kids can't hear me. Because despite everything, they never felt it. We tried to make them live in another reality. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to cover validity. While the majority of participants said that the questions were clear and not difficult to answer, their responses sometimes indicated a lack of validity in that the response options that they selected did not align with the explanation of their household's situations. So for example, participants questioned whether the FSSM items referred to the ability to access food versus being able to buy it, because there were a lot of food programs where food could be accessed without money. In this situation, as well as respondents who spoke about always having something to eat, suggested that the module could be underestimating household food insecurity. Likewise, for the second adult reference question, adults eating less than they felt they should, a participant reported that the response options were not what they expected for the question that was asked. So they ended up responding with a different answer. Similarly, the adult question 3, adults ever hungry but didn't eat, only one participant described hunger as an actual physical sensation. Instead, most participants were describing hunger in one of the following ways. Either 1, not eating when one wants to eat or should eat because they did not have money to buy food or did not have food available. 2, not having anything one wants to eat. Or 3, not feeling satisfied or full. And so this issue around validity is quite salient in regards to always having something to eat. And you can see this participant in New York talking about there always being something. And this has come up in previous research as well. Next slide. In thinking across the 18 items, the response options were difficult for many participants because in many instances, all the response options applied to their experiences. So for example, the interpretation of the response options sometimes, or in Spanish, a veces, varied between once or twice a week to every other time. And the interpretation of often, or a menudo in Spanish, varied in meaning from 5 times a year to almost always. Next slide, please. And now I want to move on to some item-specific issues that became apparent through the cognitive testing. So for household item 1, which of these statements best describes the food eaten in your household in the last 12 months? Participants felt the response options were quite confusing. So as a reminder, those response options for household item 1 are enough, but not always the kinds of food we want, sometimes not enough to eat, or often not enough to eat. In addition, the Spanish translation of often not enough was difficult for participants to understand, and one participant actually suggested instead saying there isn't always food. For household item 4, we couldn't afford to eat balanced meals. Participants were asked their preference for balanced meals versus other variations, and we pulled some of these other variations from previous research. And so only a few preferred balanced meals, while several participants preferred nutritious meals. One of the variations presented based on previous research was nutritious and varied meals, and several participants found this response option quite confusing. One participant suggested adding according to your culture, either to the end of balanced meals or nutritious meals. And more importantly, household item 4 is a good example of the double negative issues that participants struggled with. So in one case, a participant answered never to mean that they were never able to eat balanced meals, which should have led them to answer always, as the question asked how frequently they could not afford balanced meals. Next slide, please. For the adult reference questions, when participants were asked about several variations in phrasing, for 81, most participants wanted wording to capture reducing portions rather than cutting size of meals. And several participants also just suggested revising wording of item 1 to capture the frequency of skipped meals and the type of meals that were skipped. And the Spanish translation preferences also seem to vary across different heritages as well, given that certain words were more common for certain Spanish speakers than other. In addition, the Spanish translation of felt you should for the adult item 2 did not make sense to a couple of participants. And the adult reference item 3 also had an awkward Spanish translation, which made the question difficult to understand. For item 4 in the adult reference questions, and this is the one that asked participants to share if they had gained weight over the last about losing weight. But we actually had several participants say that they had actually gained weight over the last 12 months. And one of those respondents had actually, or one of those participants actually responded yes to the question about losing weight. So there was weight fluctuations that should be taken into account as well. One participant also suggested asking about changes in weight for other adults in the household because her husband had lost weight because of the anxiety of him not being able to provide for their family. Next slide, please. For the child reference questions, participants shared direct, though somewhat general responses to stage questions, indicating that they had what they needed to feed their children, or that their children always had something or enough to eat. But as the questions targeted more intense experiences of food insecurity, so these stage 2 questions, this would be questions 4 through 7, so children cutting the size or skipping meals, children being hungry, not eating for a whole day, participants indicated that these items did not apply to their children because that situation did not happen to their children. That being said, several participants indicated some uncertainty about whether their children were even hungry. They suspected hunger but weren't sure. And in addition, participants emphasized that while their children may not like the food that they were serving them, their children had enough or something to eat. And then for the item about not eating for a whole day, participants underscored that the possibility of their child not eating for the whole day was inconceivable. Next slide, please. And of course, many participants noted the emotional aspects of responding to these child-specific items. So you can see this participant from Texas says, somewhat difficult, it's hard to explain. Like I said, as a parent, the emotional, the stress. And the participant from New York saying God wouldn't allow that to happen. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take just a minute to discuss what our findings thus far and next step. I know we're running out of time. We want to make several notes of our preliminary findings. First, unsurprisingly, participants find it quite difficult emotionally to respond, recall, and discuss food insecurity experiences. Second, many participants referred to the COVID pandemic. And in fact, the effects of the pandemic may have made the FSSM items slightly less valid because saying they were often reporting they could not get the foods they wanted because of the empty shelves in grocery stores and food stores. So this is an example of how the wording may be interpreted differently depending on the context. And the context of our study is unavoidably very much about the pandemic. And then third, cognitive testing is tiring, particularly for an 18-item survey. This is really common, but it means that later items, specifically the child-referenced items, had less engagement. So we're planning to address this by shifting the question order and revising some of our probing questions. Next slide, please. Several notable strengths include the innovation, as it's the first expanded measurement approach for food insecurity with a priority population of Latinx caregivers, including exploratory interviews and this formal cognitive testing. We are collaborating on a unique multi-site sampling strategy to reflect the diverse heritages, backgrounds, and contexts of U.S. Latinx households. And then, of course, this detailed cognitive testing enables us to collect data that identifies specific aspects of wording or question structure that may influence how respondents answer and thereby impact the accuracy of the data. Next slide, please. And of course, several limitations, including this extensive probing as a part of cognitive testing, is time consuming and can be stressful, especially given the stigma and strong responses attached to food insecurity. And so this fatigue for participants can limit the willingness and ability for them to fully respond to questions. In addition, preliminary results provide limited evidence right now for a comprehensive understanding of these child reference questions because we just had less data collected from them. And so the placement of the child reference questions towards the last third of the interview meant that participants were much more fatigued. And last, given the ongoing pandemic, engaging with communities to recruit participants remotely has been challenging, but we are pivoting to the situation and trying new approaches. Next slide, please. So given that the FSSM questions are intended to be administered in a set order, we're not going to change the order in our interviews. Instead, we plan to first administer the full FSSM as normally used, and then conduct an in-depth cognitive interview on specific questions, not in the order of the FSSM. And as mentioned previously, we're continuing to nurture existing community partnerships to boost recruitment and intend to share our findings with these community partners as well as a greater public and academic audiences. Next slide. So in conclusion, Latinx caregivers demonstrated some misunderstanding and confusion about the FSSM items and response options, which has potential implications for validity. And furthermore, our findings really provide some insight into not only food insecurity among Latinx caregivers, but in general, but also during this COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. And a quick acknowledgement to, of course, our funding funders, USDA and Tufts, and our excellent cross-site student research team. These students have gone above and beyond and are just excellent to work with. And it's exciting to bring them in on such wonderful research. And then, of course, our community partners and the participating families in the study. Thank you.